ask a provocative question. Are many sex, gender differences really just power differences in disguise? And we know that there's a lot of disparate outcomes that exist between men and women. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about what is the root cause of that, similar to what Mabel talked about, similar to what Modupe talked about. Now, a lot of what I'm going to be talking about today is featured in a book that I published a couple years ago, Friend and Foe. But we saw a lot of example of disparate outcomes already featured today. So I'm going to give you the exact same data that Mabel did, that women make 79 cents on the dollar. We also know that women are vastly underrepresented in the highest echelons of organizations, both CEOs and boards of directors. Speaking about entrepreneurship, we see research done at Harvard Business School did studies where they found that investors would fund male entrepreneurs at twice the rate that they would fund female entrepreneurs. In analysis that I did of every election in the United States since women gained suffrage, women are 36% less likely to be elected governor or US senator than men. And we even see this in some of what we might call aptitude tests. So in every year that they've measured gender and the SAT math scores, there is a consistent male advantage, scoring higher on these tests. And this is true for every ethnicity in the United States. And so one of the questions is, what is the origins of these sex differences? What are the origins of these gender differences? Especially when we look at something like the SAT scores, which seems like it might be related to some sort of innate ability. In fact, Larry Summers got in a lot of trouble when trying to understand the vast disparate outcomes between men and women as professors and researchers in the sciences. He suggested that there is different availability of aptitude at the high end, suggesting that somehow women didn't have the brains that were going to be most successful at science and math. This was obviously a controversial statement. It actually cost him his presidency of Harvard for making this statement. But it does raise that question of, what are the causes of this? We know that men and women went through different evolutionary pressures, sex selection pressures. We know that men and women do differ in the number of hormones and the type of hormones that they have. But I'm going to suggest a different idea, which is that many gender differences are really just power differences in disguise. And I'm going to describe to you 2 decades of research that I've done. Starting with my PhD, I've been studying power and negotiations and leadership. And so this is going to summarize a lot of the research that I've done. Now, to really contextualize it, we have to understand that every person in this room has what we might call a range of acceptable behavior. When we are within that range, we get rewarded by people, and we reward ourselves by feeling comfortable. Sometimes we step outside that range, and we become too strong and assertive for what we're willing to accept or others are willing to accept, and we get punished. Sometimes we step outside that range by being too weak, and we also get punished. So everyone has a range of acceptable behavior. But here's the key. That range isn't static. It isn't fixed. It's actually pretty dynamic. And what determines that range is your power. Now, power comes in many forms. In negotiations, power comes in the form of your alternatives. Do you have strong alternatives so you can bargain more effectively? Sometimes we feel less powerful when we're in a new experience, like an immigrant coming to a new country, or my wife and I felt as new parents. Sometimes it comes from our position. Are we a CEO? Are we the person that controls important decisions? And our power changes from moment to moment and situation to situation. But our power also comes from some of our demographic characteristics. And here's the thing. When you have lots of power, you have a wide range of acceptable behavior. You have a lot of leeway in what you can say and do. But when you lack power, your range of acceptable behavior narrows. You don't have a lot of leeway in how you can behave. And so what I've recognized in my research over these 2 decades is this is the key to understanding a lot of gender differences. I'm going to talk today about 2 ways that this power affecting our range of acceptable behavior really matters. First, I've documented in dozens, hundreds of studies that power has psychological effects. And one of the things it does, it changes the range that we give ourselves in our own mind. But I'm also going to document these interpersonal effects. Our power affects the range that other people allow us. So let me start off with the psychological effects. As I mentioned, I've been studying power for 2 decades, and I've done tons of studies. These studies have been replicated all across the world. Hundreds and hundreds of studies have been done since I started working on this topic. And one of the things that we've discovered is that a lot of gender differences can be reproduced with power manipulations. What do I mean by that? That means that if men score higher on some dimension than women, if we take people into the laboratory and we randomly assign them to a high power condition and some people to a low power condition, those randomly assigned to the high power condition will score higher on that attribute. Or if women score higher on an attribute than men, and we randomly assign people to these power conditions, those in the low power condition will score higher on that attribute. I'm not going to bore you with the list of these dozens, but I'm going to give you 2 examples. Here's the first example. Research by Linda Babcock has shown something really important and really fascinating, that women don't ask. In one study, she found that men were 4 times as likely graduating from Carnegie Mellon to have negotiated their first salary than women. Here's a little experiment she did. She brought people in the lab. She gave people boggle tasks. She told people at the beginning, you're going to get paid anywhere from $3 to $10. But she paid everyone $3. And then she just looked, who actually asked for any more money? They heard some people got paid 10. She found men were 7 times more likely to ask for more money than women. Here's an experiment we did. We brought people in the lab. We randomly assigned them to high power condition. We said, you're the boss, you control these resources. Or we said, you're the subordinate, the boss was going to direct you. And then we looked at the likelihood that people felt comfortable negotiating, and again, we replicate that effect, so that high power people felt more comfortable negotiating. Here's something where women score higher on. Women are better at men than identifying other people's emotions. We do this by showing people pictures of faces, and we say, what emotion was this person experiencing? Here again, we brought people randomly into the lab, and we assigned them to either a baseline or a high power condition. Those in the high power condition were worse at interpreting the emotions of other people. Notice something really, really important here. We have randomly assigned people to conditions. Their power is temporary, and it's affecting these basic psychological processes like confidence or social perception. The second important finding here, these effects occurred equally for men and women. So I've shown you that dozens of gender differences can be reproduced by power manipulations. So one of the things that power is doing is having psychological effects affecting the range that we give ourselves. But they also have interpersonal effects. They affect the range that others allow us. And you've all heard of something called the gender double bind. Women who don't speak up go unnoticed, but women who do often get punished. But I've actually coined a phrase because I think that this gender double bind represents something broader and larger. And I actually coined the phrase the low power double bind. When you lack power, you don't speak up and you go unnoticed, but if you do, you get rejected. Let me give you 2 examples of this. This is a really tragic story of Nazareth College. A woman gets offered a job in a department there as a professor. She writes an email that is so ideal. It is as if I wrote it for one of my MBA students, giving them advice about how to negotiate. In this email, she's going to ask for more, but she's going to express enthusiasm for the job. She's not making demands. She's asking questions. She says, I'd like an increase of my salary and some time off from maternity leave and no more than 3 class preps. And maybe just postpone the date 1 year so I can finish my postdoc. I know that some of these gestures, some of these might be easier than others. Just let me know what you think. That's literally the email I would have given an MBA student to write negotiating for their job, or one of my PhD students. How did they respond? They withdrew the offer from her. Now, here's why I also think it's related to power. My twin brother is a documentary filmmaker, and early on in his career, with one of his first films, he actually got an offer from a distributor. And I just started out as a negotiation researcher, and I saw this as the perfect opportunity to use my skills in the real world. And so I helped him craft what I thought was the perfect counteroffer. It actually was perfect. Turns out it was perfectly offensive. It turns out He didn't have any power. He had no other offers. They had lots of other films he can buy. They literally withdrew the offer from him, and they wouldn't even let him accept the original offer. So we can see how these processes are doing it. So how do we reduce the low power double bind? Well, we got to expand the range in our own eyes and in the eyes of others. How do we do that? Well, let's take negotiations. This is a very clear, robust, replicable finding that on average, when a man negotiates against a woman, the man gets a little bit better outcome than the woman. But a couple researchers, one graduated from Columbia Business School, got her PhD, Emily Manitoula, another one, a researcher at Harvard, Hannah Riley Bowles, found that there's one situation where women perform equally well as men. And that is when they're advocating for other people. Let's go back to Madupe's thing. When we're advocating for others, we're being assertive, but we're being communal also, right? So it's actually gender consistent with the stereotypes. This is actually called the mama bear effect. Like a mama bear defending her cubs, women, when they're advocating for others, are allowed to be ferocious. Here's one other example, and this relates to another double bind that particularly falls harder on women, and that's the self-promotion double bind. We know from research that when people advertise their accomplishments, they get punished. But if they don't advertise them, they go unnoticed. Women face this more strongly than men. Now, what some brilliant research by Bob Cialdini and Christina Fong have shown, and others, Jeff Pfeffer, is that we can solve this dilemma by getting people to self-promote on our behalf. We don't actually share accomplishments. Someone else does. How do we get people to do that? Well, one of the things that I've been studying is the strategic benefits of asking other people for advice. Notice when we ask people for advice, the benefits we get. We flatter them, and we show humility. We ask them to take our perspective. Their advice is like an investment in us. They want to then commit to us and give us more. And this is incredibly powerful that it even works when you see it coming. I want to show you, I'll tell you a little story. We had a young assistant professor at Kellogg. I used to be at the Kellogg School of Management. And at the end of her first year, she went to another junior faculty member and said, I don't really have strong relationships with the senior faculty that will one day vote on my tenure, my partnership in this university. And he gave her the advice, why don't you follow Adam's research and ask the senior colleagues for advice? Now, he told me that he had given her this advice. So one day I get an email, and this is the exact email I got, that says, you can see the subject heading right there says advice. And she was self-promoting a little bit, but also asking for genuine advice. She just got an invitation to resubmit a paper at the top journal in the world, Science. And she said, I'd love to get your advice about what I should do with these reviews. And I just want to point out three really important things about this example. First, I've studied these strategic benefits of asking other people for advice. Two, I had been forewarned that she was likely to come use this technique on me. And third, it still worked. So anytime I saw a senior colleague, I, did you hear she got this great R&R opportunity at Science? And I sat down that night and really read the reviews and gave her advice. So we can see how we can start to overcome this double bind. So I've tried to tell you two things. That our power determines our range of acceptable behavior in our own mind and in the minds of other people. So we need to find some solutions. I gave you a couple ones. Advocating on behalf of others. Asking other people for advice. But if we take this seriously, that many gender differences are really power differences in disguise, the solution is incredibly clear. Right? We need to give women more power. I'm going to show you how clear this is. Let's go back to this. This is, again, I said, the gender difference in math across many, many years that's continued unabated. And I also told you that it occurs for every single ethnicity in the United States. Seeing this would be very easy to think about a biological cause for why men and women are in different math ability. But some researchers at University of Chicago and Kellogg asked an even more important question. Let's look at the whole world. What's the gender math gap like there? And here we can see there's a wide range. It's really strong in Turkey. It's pretty strong in Korea, moderate in the US, as you can see. But look at Norway and Sweden. It starts to disappear. And in Iceland, women actually outperform men on these math tests? Well, they did something a step further. They asked, can we predict how these gender gaps exist, larger or smaller? And they used something called the Women's Emancipation Index from the United Nations. Do women have power in business and politics? And as you can see, the more power that women had in society, this math gap disappeared. I'll give you just one other example of some exciting research I've done, and it's not written up yet, but we took this exact same measure, this women's emancipation thing, and showed that we could actually predict not just the soccer performance of female World Cup teams, we could actually predict the soccer performance of male World Cup teams. So countries that had greater gender equality had higher performing male teams. Why? Because they had better talent. Why? Because if they were treating women more equally, they were treating many members of society more equally. So the conclusion is, I think, very, very clear. Many gender differences will be eliminated when women have more power. And so we all have an obligation to help this process further along. When women have more opportunities in business, when women have more opportunities in politics, it's not just helping those women, it's not just giving people role models, it's literally changing the fundamental aspects of the mind, such as math ability or the confidence that we feel in any given situation.